Lag BaOmer is associated specifically with one personality, right? There's a few personalities, but the central personality is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, right? What are we celebrating on Lag BaOmer? We're celebrating the Torah Sod, right? Torah Nistar, the Kabbala. So what is this? What is it? Why is it important? How is it relevant to the other Chagim in the month of Iyar? Right? What is this Torah? Who is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, first of all? Who is he a student of? What does he want? Right? When did he live? Do you guys know who Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was? Okay. Yeah. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, let's say he's a student of Rabbi Akiva, initially. Right? Later he'll have a new teacher we'll talk about, but he's a student of Rabbi Akiva, ben-Yosef. Rabbi Akiva is the most important of all the Tanaim in the Gemara. Right? There's no opinion in the Gemara more important than the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So who is Rabbi Akiva ben-Yosef before he becomes Rabbi Akiva?
The shepherd.
We know he's a shepherd. Right? We know that he didn't learn Torah until he was 40. We also
Jewish princess.
Where he marries a wealthy man's daughter, right? Right. We also know that Rabbi Akiva hated the Chachamim. He hated the Chachamim to the point that he said if he had met a Talmid Chacham, he would bite him like a donkey. What's the difference between a donkey bite and a dog bite?
Donkey doesn't stop.
Donkey bites through the bone. Meaning Rabbi Akiva really hates the Chachamim. So what's going on? Who hates the Chachamim at this time in history? Nobody hates the Chachamim. It's not like there's a tikshoret, a media that's making people anti the rabbis.
This is Beit Sheni. The temple is still standing, right?
Not when he's Rabbi Akiva, it's not.
No.
But the question is, so my suspicion, and there's no way I could prove this, I haven't found any evidence to support this except for the things that I just put on the table, that before Rabbi Akiva was Rabbi Akiva, when he was young, he was a fighter in the rebellions against the Romans, in probably the Great Revolt, where we lost Jerusalem. And we lost Jerusalem, some people would argue, because of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. That Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai actually made a deal with the Romans that didn't involve the preservation of the Beit HaMikdash. I mean, we could make lots of arguments in defense of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai.
The guy that didn't eat?
No.
Only like suck fig juice or something?
No. No, we say Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was snuck out of Jerusalem. And he met with Vespasian in Gofna, and he basically addressed him as emperor. He wasn't yet the emperor, but he basically came from he didn't support the war, as opposed to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the other Gadol Hador of that generation, and he did support the war. Right? You have two giants leading Israel in Torah. You have Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. One is opposed to the war, one is a supporter of the war. Now, also something important to keep in mind here, Josephus, right? In Josephus's writings, because most of what we know about this war we learned from Josephus, he says that in this time period, there were four major hashkafot, the four major philosophical approaches to the Torah amongst the Jewish people. The first is the Pharisees, right? Which is what we can call the rabbinical approach, the approach of the Chachamim. Then you have the Sadducees, right? The Tzdukim, who reject the idea of Torah Shebal Peh, which is extremely problematic, and they reject the idea of Olam Haba, which is also problematic, right? You had a lot of the upper class, including the upper class Kohanim, who had gone over to this way of thinking, and a lot of them were allied to the Romans. Then you have the Essenes, who are kind of a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? They separate from politics. Ascetic. They separate from politics and participation in history. Well, we today kind of call Haredi. A lot live by the Dead Sea. They live in different places, but there was a group like in Qumran and by the Dead Sea. And we're talking about a group that was, and some people would argue that the early Christians came out of this group or were influenced by this group, that they saw politics, they saw history, they saw participation in national events as something that was kind of corrupting, and they wanted just to be pure, holy people. Okay. And then you have the fourth philosophy, what Josephus calls the fourth philosophy, which we can call the Zealot philosophy. Now, Josephus has two things very important about this perspective. Number one, he says it's the most popular of all four, especially among the youth. Like it's the most widespread among the youth, number one. And number two, the only difference between this approach and the Pharisees is that it emphasizes, I'm not sure the Pharisees necessarily disagree, but it emphasizes that there's a mitzvah d'oraita to liberate our land from foreign rule always. That
What was the name of this group?
the Zealots, the fourth philosophy, that we're never allowed to permit foreign rule over our land. If there's foreign rule, if there's Roman rule over our land, we have to fight them.
So this is post Great Revolt, or
No, this is before. And this leads into the Great Revolt. They obviously become major figures in the Great Revolt. But we're saying that this is, according to Josephus, this is the difference between them and the Pharisees. That they're holding that we have an obligation in every generation to free our land from foreign rule. Right? And it doesn't mean the Pharisees disagree in theory that we should have independence, that we should be free, but the Pharisees can say, now's not the time. The Zealots say it's always the time. We always have to fight to liberate our land. Now, according to the Ramban, they're correct. Right? Because the Ramban rules that way also, that it's a mitzvah in every generation to conquer the land of Israel, to develop it, settle it, and to not let any of it fall into foreign hands.
what about the three oaths?
3 oaths are not halacha. They're not the Midrash Haggadah.
What 3 oaths?
I made you promise the daughters of Jerusalem that you won't force the redemption, make aliyah like a wall, revolt against the nations, and it says after that the nations won't persecute you too much. It's in a few places, but
by every Jewish community.
that's a claim that certain rabbis make, but that's not the halacha. The Ramban says something very different. And the Shulchan Aruch in Even Ezer, Siman Ayin Hey, in the Pitchei Tshuva, the Pitchei Tshuva Vav, it says all the Rishonim and all the Achronim hold by the Ramban. And it doesn't mean every Rishon and Achron holds by the Ramban, but it says that they do. Meaning there are definitely Rishonim and Achronim we could point to who don't hold by the Ramban, but if the fact that the Pitchei Tshuva is saying there that all the Rishonim and all the Achronim hold by the Ramban, it means it's a strong opinion. Okay. But that's the position of the Kanaim. The position of the fourth philosophy, the position of the Zealot movement is that we have an obligation always to fight to free our land. By the way, I think that the truth is the 3 oaths, I think, are a code also. I think that what does too much mean? What does it mean that the nations of the world won't persecute you too much? What's too much? Who has a concrete definition of too much? I know that for some people, being called a kike is too much. Right? Too much. If I feel that's too much, then I have to revolt. I have to force a redemption. I have to make aliyah. Right? But for some people, there were Jews, let's say in the United States, who in 1945 sat down for coffee and opened up their newspaper and saw that 6 million of their people had been systematically butchered, and it wasn't too much. They continued to live as Americans. They went to work. They raised their children in the United States. They raised their grandchildren in the United States. It wasn't too much. So too much depends on the health of your soul. Right? But I think that's what Chazal is really telling us with this Midrash Haggadah, that too much depends on what we experience as too much. It's not for Gentiles to look at and say, we can't persecute them too much. They're doing their labiyut. It's not a contract. So if it says the nations won't persecute you too much, that's meant for us. It's not a contract they have to uphold.
In exchange for us not...
Right, no, but it means, what does too much mean? When it's too much, you have to revolt.
I think it is. That can make it what?
Meaning that to make aliyah, to revolt against the nations, to force the redemption.
Uh-huh.
So we internally know we have to do those things when we experience the persecution is too much, but to experience persecution is too much is vague and subjective.
I guess it's the same way that after October 7th, there are groups that say, okay, now we need to take over Gaza again, and now it's too much, enough is enough. And there are other groups that are saying, no, it's not too much yet.
Okay. Well, or I think everyone kind of experienced that as too much, but they have different reactions based on their own maybe perceptions of Israel's interests and what they think the story is really about. I think that's a more complicated discussion. But I think Israeli society and maybe even a lot of the Jewish world experienced October 7th as too much. Like that wasn't, no one was like, but maybe not. Maybe you're right. I don't know. It's something worth thinking about. But my suspicion is that Rabbi Akiva fought the Romans as one of the Zealot fighters, felt betrayed by the Chachamim, hated the Chachamim. And only later, when he became not only one of the Chachamim, but really the leader, the greatest opinion in the Gemara, actually criticizes in Gittin, he criticizes Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai for his move. Although I think there's a defense we can make of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and based on the time, based on what was happening in history, I certainly don't think it could be applied to today. I don't think that's a position we follow today, but definitely under the circumstances of that time, we can see justification for the line of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, based on the fact that we were going into Galut, and he saw that we were going into Galut, and he wanted to preserve some things. But Rabbi Akiva disagreed. So Rabbi Akiva, when he becomes the leader of the generation, he starts another revolt against the Romans, the bar-Kokhba revolt, right? He's the arms bearer of Shimon bar Kokhba. And that succeeds for a while until it doesn't, and then it's crushed by the Romans. And the rabbis are hunted for public execution. Rabbi Akiva is publicly executed. And Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai continues to agitate against the Romans. And he has to flee. And he has to go hide in a cave. We were at the cave last year. We went to the cave where he and his son, Elazar, lived for 12 years. And in the cave, it's a very small cave, by the way. I've been to we have many large caves in this country. This happens to be a very small cave. And it's all the way in the north. And
It's on Harlem Road?
no, it's the north.
Okay.
Yeah. You have to go through like a Druze village to get there. Yeah. So it's down there. And it's very interesting, very small. It's very small, a little plaque, but he gets a new teacher in that cave, and it's Eliyahu Navi. Who's Eliyahu Navi? Eliyahu Navi, according to Chazal, is Pinchas ben Elazar HaKohen, right? Who never died. Now, Pinchas is known as a Kanai, right? The Zealot movement is based on Pinchas. It's based on Eliyahu. I'm suspecting that Pinchas, Eliyahu, played a major behind-the-scenes role, both in a revolt against the Seleucid Greeks and against the Romans. Okay? That there's actually... he's a major figure behind the scenes in the rebel leadership, both when the Maccabean were fighting and when the Kanaim, the Zealots, were fighting. And by the way, I'm going to argue that the Zealots are the ideological continuation of the Maccabean. And I would say that the Pharisees are the ideological continuation of the Hasidim. There's a group called the Hasidim who existed at the time of the Hashmonaim. They made up the bulk of the Maccabean troops at the beginning of the revolt. But I don't want to get into the details of the story, but after the Hanukkah story, not after that battle, but after the following battle, the battle of Beit Zachariah, where Elazar is killed, killing the elephant. After that battle, and Lysias offering us peace, which basically meant we can have Shabbat again, and Torah, and Rosh Chodesh, and our calendar, and Brit Milah, we can have all our culture back, live according to our ways, but accept Greek rule, the Hasidim split from the Maccabean. The Hasidim said yes, the Maccabean said no. Because the Maccabean claimed, Yehuda and his brothers, surviving brothers, claimed that we have to have political independence. It's not enough to live according to our ways under Greek rule. Okay? And that's the position, of course, of the Zealots. So the Zealots are the ideological continuation of the Maccabean. The Pharisees are the ideological continuation of the Hasidim. Now, what did Eliyahu Navi teach Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai? According to Chazal, the Zohar HaKadosh, the Kabbala, right? Torah Tesod, right? That this is and what's one way of understanding this? The Torah of the Zealots was hidden in the Kabbala. That's what the Kabbala, the Torah Tesod, the Zohar HaKadosh, is actually the Torah of the Zealots. But because remember, the Romans are looking at everything we're writing at the time, right? The Romans are listening very carefully to what the Jews are saying, because the Romans want to stamp out all Jewish extremism, all Jewish fundamentalism. Because what do the Romans want? The Romans want peace. That's what the Romans want. Every oppressor wants peace. You want to know, if you look at any conflict anywhere in the world, who's the oppressor, who's the oppressed? The one who says we want peace is the oppressor. The one who says we want justice, we want change, we want revolution, we want freedom, that's the oppressed. That's why I think it's so problematic that all the pro-Israel organizations on the North American campuses say Israel wants peace. Like that's like their argument. Israel wants peace. That makes you the oppressor. What's peace? A non-violent version of the status quo. I want peace to continue exploiting and benefiting from the situation without you fighting back. That's what peace means. That's what the Romans wanted. They wanted peace. They wanted the Jews not to fight and let the Romans rule our land. So the Romans are listening very carefully, and the Romans see, by the way, the Romans see the Torah in the same way that I think like Fox News sees the Quran. Right? The Romans understand the Torah as a book that makes Jews violent, that makes Jews terrorists. And therefore they have to outlaw the Torah. They do outlaw the Torah, ultimately. They outlaw tzitzit. The reason why till today Jewish men wear tzitzit under their shirts, as opposed to being on their outer garment. It used to be we would wear shirts that were four-cornered with blue and white strings hanging from the corners of the outer garment. We started wearing these like kind of undershirts with strings on them under our shirt because the Romans outlawed tzitzit. Right? The Romans outlawed the study of Torah. The Romans hunted down the rabbis for execution. The Romans made it illegal for us to live anywhere from where we could even see the ruins of Jerusalem. Right? The Romans, because they understood that any Jew who could remember Jerusalem would remember his right hand in revolt. Right? We say, if I forget Jerusalem, I should forget my right hand. That's what Hadrian wanted. The Emperor Hadrian wanted the Jews to forget their right hands, stop fighting, be docile. And therefore the Torah was a problem. And you have now rabbis who want the Pharisees, who want to prove to the Romans that the Torah is safe. Let us have Torah. Don't destroy the Torah. And we'll create a Torah that doesn't want to fight you.
The Pharisees accepted the Galut.
Essentially, and maybe that was what they were supposed to do. Right. And they created, what did they create? Who was it actually? Rabban Gamliel II, who was a son of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who was an anti-Roman leader. I said he was the other Gadol who we rarely talk about. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was the one who opposed the revolt. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel supported the revolt. He's executed by the Romans, and his son becomes the next leader of Israel at Yavne. Like, he's the one who concretized the Amidah, the Shmona Esrei.
So right? The Gamliel was first who's with the Zealots?
Yes, that's the Zealot. The position of Rabban Gamliel II, I think, was a Zealot position. His father, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, was with the Zealots, right? And what I'm saying is that the way we presented ourselves by necessity at that time was as non-threatening. We're not a threat to Rome. We don't want to fight Rome. We're accepting Galut. We're accepting Roman rule because we have no choice. And the Jews who believed we had a choice, who kept agitating to fight and fight and fight, were killed. Right? And there was a desire among the Chachamim, even the ones who were sympathetic to the Zealot position, to preserve our identity. What did Rabban Gamliel do when he was the leader at Yavne? He created basically a portable version of our entire national culture that we could take with us into Galut. including the tefillah, including everything. And that's important, right? He prepared us for Galut. In a way, by the way, that the northern kingdom was never prepared for Galut. Why did we lose all those tribes? Because they weren't prepared for Galut. We were able to create a portable version of our culture that many centuries later became rebranded as a religion called Judaism. What they did at Yavna, what they created at Yavna, many centuries later, like maybe 300 years ago, became a religion called Judaism. But there was no word Judaism back then. That's not how we saw ourselves. That's not how we saw what we were doing. So, but what Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai does is he takes the perspective of the Zealots and he hides it in the Kabbalistic literature, which the Romans can't really understand or read, and even that wasn't so accessible, right? And what happens to this? This Torah, what we call the Kabbala, remains for centuries the exclusive property of giants, right? You have, and you have different ways of understanding it. In a lot of the Arabic-speaking world, you had Chachamim who approached the Kabbalah one way. In Europe, you have the Baal Shem Tov and his students, a later movement called Hasidim that's not connected at all to the Hasidim of the Second Temple period, and they basically turned the Kabbalistic literature into a psychology. But then you have another group, which includes, I think, Rabbi Yehuda Levi and the Ramban and the Ramchal and the Maharal of Prague and the Gaon of Vilna and eventually Rav Kook, who we can say returned the ideas of the Kabbalah back into a philosophy. Okay, meaning they're kind of unpacking it in its most authentic way. But that also remained the property of very few giants of Torah. That wasn't widespread, meaning that wasn't something that every Jew understood and every Jew learned, right? There are all these ideas, you can't learn it until you're 40, and even then, who can understand it, right? So you have these giants who understood it, and even Rav Kook, right, who's alive for the Zionist movement, who is explaining the Zionist movement from a divine perspective, what's going on. Not that Ben Gurion or Herzl or Ahad Ha'am or Jabotinsky knew what they were doing, but that Hashem is doing something through them, and that's what Rav Kook says we need to understand. What the Kadosh Baruch Hu is doing here. But even Rav Kook, how many students did Rav Kook really have? 3, 4? Real students, real Talmidim who understood his teachings and went and spread them. 3, 4 students, Berach, right? But in the time of his top student, his son, Rav Yehuda HaKohen Kook, something happened. Remember, the Torah, the Torah of the Zealots, when did it go underground? When did it start hiding from us? When did it become inaccessible? Pretty much when we lost Yerushalayim.
After the bar-Kokhba about it?
Yeah, we'll start with the Great Revolt and losing the temple, but then in the bar-Kokhba revolt we had Jerusalem again, we possessed Jerusalem again, and then we lost it. And around then is when, again, Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai goes and hides in the cave, and he encodes all this in the Zohar HaKadosh. The Zohar HaKadosh says that the Shekhinah will not return to Yerushalayim Shalmala until Am Yisrael returns to Yerushalayim Shalmata. Meaning when we say Shalmala, we can say like the code, right? Let's say this world, let's pretend this world we occupy is a website, and there's code behind the website, and that's what the Torah is teaching us often, right? The plumbing behind the faucet, the code behind the website. There's a terrestrial Jerusalem, the mountain city that we sometimes, that technically we're in it now because the borders of Jerusalem include Kiryat Moshe today, but certainly, Yerushalayim between the walls, right? That's the mountain city, that's terrestrial Jerusalem. But then there's also celestial Jerusalem, right? Like, for example, when Yaakov had his dream on my mountain, the mountain was Luz, that was next to Luz, right? It says, according to Rashi, that Yerushalayim Shalmala, the back end of Jerusalem, the code of Jerusalem, met Yaakov in material Luz, and the meeting between the code of Jerusalem and the front end of Luz became Beit El. And then he started calling it Beit El, right? And that's why we call it Beit El. So that, it's just how the interaction. So it says in the Zohar HaKadosh that the Shekhinah won't return to Yerushalayim, the code, Shel Mala, until Am Yisrael returns to Yerushalayim Shel Mata. So what happened? What happened is 19 years after we survived but lost the War of 48, right? We lost Yerushalayim. History opens a door, and we have to fight Egypt and Syria and Jordan in the Six-Day War. We return to Jerusalem, right? The paratroopers conquered Jerusalem. We return to Jerusalem on the 28th of Iyar, which B'ezrat Hashem will celebrate in a couple of weeks. We come back to Yerushalayim. And what happens then? This Torah that had been the exclusive property of a tiny minority of Chachamim becomes accessible. All these institutions teaching the Torah of Rav Kook, what we call the Torah of Rav Kook, is essentially the Torah of Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai, Rabbi Akiva, right? Which the Torah of the Maharal, the Torah of the Ramchal, the Torah of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, the Torah of the Vilna Gaon, right? And this Torah of Rav Kook was still hard for anybody to really access. Even today, Charedim have trouble understanding it, right? Like even the Charedim who are becoming more nationalist, they don't embrace this Torah. They don't really engage with this Torah. They're more kind of becoming Kahanistim. Like when a Haredi becomes nationalist, it becomes like a Kahanist, because Kahanism is basically Haredi Torah with nationalism. Like Rav Kook's Torah is a whole different thing that's rooted in Kabbala and an understanding of how Hashem's running the world and how we're meant to participate. And so what happens? This Torah that was the exclusive property of giants becomes accessible to the nation. And suddenly you have dozens and dozens of Torah institutions teaching this Torah, including Mechon Mir, right? And suddenly it's understandable to guys like us that we can actually come and learn this Torah because Yerushalayim was liberated. Because Am Yisrael came back to Yerushalayim Shel Mata, material Jerusalem, terrestrial Jerusalem. We came back. So this Torah is suddenly accessible to the nation once again.